The day that they decide that they want to live next to the Jewish state of Israel rather than instead of it is the day we make peace. So Westsplaining is when Western diplomats and journalists explain away what Arabs and especially Palestinians are very clearly expressing. When the West essentially caves in to agree to fund UNRWA and to never close it down, despite the fact that it's not fulfilling its mission of settling the Arab refugees, they are essentially paying protection to the mob. I do not define anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism as a prejudice or a conspiracy or a hatred even. I define it as a political scapegoating mechanism for societies in crisis. Palestinianism is really the mask behind which anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism hides. The task ahead is essentially the reconstruction of the Palestinian identity.
Great to meet you. I've been enjoying is not the word, but I've been digging into your book over the week, The War of Return, which is quite surreal to read post October 7th. A lot of the things that are being said now publicly have been said by you and others a few years ago, and really highlight what you call the indulgence, the Western indulgence that has been going on of a Palestinian ideal, which has really perpetuated radicalism and violence in the region. So the first thing I thought I would say to you is something that was said to Douglas Murray when he was interviewed soon after the attacks. And it wasn't a question, it was a statement. And the statement was, the good news is you were right, but the bad news is you were right. Is that a good place to start with for you?
I mean, it's a terrible place, but yes, I mean, it's something that I've been saying for years now. It's been at least 20 years that I've been writing and speaking and researching on the general Palestinian ethos, and again, the manner in which the West is either blind to it or indulges it, or who knows, secretly supports it. But so in many ways, I'm just continuing doing the same thing. It's true that more people are willing to listen than in the past, but still, it's a very, still a lot of people don't want to see.
So just to break it down, say for somebody who hasn't read your book and hasn't gone deeply into the kind of relationship between these international NGOs, UNRWA, and Palestinian society, how would you describe how that functions?
So, you know what, I might share a moment that I had a couple of weeks ago. I call it the most neo-colonial moment I had probably ever. Was a very senior Western official that had to look into UNRWA and again, the manner in which UNRWA breeds violent terrorism and implicated in it. And I went through the history of UNRWA and how it is essentially a mechanism intended to allow Palestinians to funnel Western support, Western funding for their battle against the Jewish state. And I could see her and her team, they were very annoyed by my message. And at one point I said, you know what, you don't want to listen to me, then just listen to Palestinians. They keep telling you. I even had a big sign from a Palestinian neighborhood mistakenly called a refugee camp near Beit Lechem under the Palestinian Authority. No one ever questions why in Palestine, under Palestinian control, you have generations of people who are called refugees. But at the entrance to this place is a sign that says, UNRWA services are our right until return. Basically, a complete sense of entitlement that says, the West, the world owes us funding for education, again, an education that keeps on breeding terrorism and war. But the West owes us those services of healthcare and education until return. And, the book is called The War of Return. And over the years, people had this notion that this is an exaggerated title. Return is, it's a nostalgia. It's an innocent idea. It's a nostalgia for our great grandparents' home, long lost. And ever since October 7th, I tell people, look, October 7th is return. October 7th is the day by day, minute by minute realization of the Palestinian vision of what return is. It was never an innocent idea. It was always this brutal triumphalism over the Jewish state. So I tell all these things to these senior Western official, and I tell her, listen to the Palestinians. They're telling you that UNRWA is not an aid organization. They're telling you that UNRWA is a political organization, the guarantor, from their perspective, of this idea of return. And return, again, is not an innocent idea. It's a brutal triumphalism over the Jewish state. And she says they don't get to decide. And I was shocked by this response because, again, I could not imagine a more neo-colonial response. And also one that is so disconnected, because actually, not only is it the Palestinians who get to decide, they've been the ones who have been controlling UNRWA since the 60s. It's by now a purely Palestinian organization devoted to the Palestinian ethos of no Jewish state. Is that she didn't understood is that the West is actually being played or being used for the Palestinian purpose. So contrary to her, this kind of notion, oh, they don't get to decide, is they very much get to decide. And it is you, the West, who are sustaining them, indulging them, supporting them in their singular, decades-long commitment to there not being a Jewish state.
So there's almost two sets of indulgence going on. You're saying there's the indulgence of this idea of Palestinian return, victory, and there's Western indulgence of their own sense of leadership in what is essentially a mafia-run region.
Yes, I mean, in the book we explain that when the West in the 50s decides to cave into Arab pressure to keep UNRWA open, despite the fact that it was going to be a temporary mechanism for settling refugees after the war, despite the fact that it's not settling a single Arab refugee, despite the fact that the Palestinians have taken it over, when the West essentially caves in to agree to fund UNRWA and to never close it down, despite the fact that it's not fulfilling its mission of settling the Arab refugees, they are essentially paying protection to the mob. Because they're thinking, we need Arab oil. We want to make sure they don't switch sides in the Cold War, even though they did. But so this is going to be a way to keep them pacified, and it's small change, but it is essentially a protection. It's paying protection to the mob. And over time, the West convinces itself that it is an ideal, that it is something good, but it has never been anything other than paying protection to the mob.
So you focus quite a lot on UNRWA as a kind of example of this paradigm, as well as the actual organization that facilitates all of this. But what you're saying in terms of the narrative coming from Palestinian Arabs, listening to them, and actually goes way back to the 30s and to the British Mandate. I think the quote you included was from Abdul Hadi, the Arab Muslim leader, under the Peel Commission, saying there's no such thing as the country Palestine. Palestine is the term Zionists invented. This construction of Palestinian identity is echoed through the PLO leadership. I've got a quote from Mohsen Zuhair Mohsen, who was the military commander of the PLO. He explicitly says there's no difference between us, Jordanians, Syrians, Lebanese. We're part of one people. The establishment of a state is just a means to continue the struggle against Israel and for Arab unity. So is what you're saying not just listen to the Palestinian Arabs who are now part of an UNRWA establishment, but listen to the message of Palestinian Arabs all the way back 100 years?
Certainly. One of the things that I'm most proud of in the book, The War of Return, is that in the work that Adi Schwartz, my co-writer, and I did, we gave Palestinian Arabs the respect of taking them at their word. We gave them the respect of listening to them. And this is something this message that I constantly bring again and again. Give them the respect of listening to them. They are telling you what their purpose is, what their goal is. In the book, I invented a word, I call it Westsplaining. It's when Western diplomats and journalists explain away what Palestinians have just said. You see it all the time. We're seeing it even now with the notion that Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians, and Palestinians keep saying, but it does, and they are our brothers, and Palestinians are thrilled and euphoric at October 7th and refuse to condemn it. And yet the West wants to tell itself a story that Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians. And in the book, I include a quote by someone who actually went around and listened to the Arabs at the time, Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister of after World War II. And he explains why Britain failed to achieve independence for the Jews. This is the mandate with which it was entrusted unanimously by the League of Nations. It did not fail the Arabs. It created Iraq, it created Jordan, but it failed the Jews. And it was purposefully tasked with enabling the Jews and the Arabs achieve independence. Again, it did so for the Arabs, but not for the Jews. And when he explains why they failed in February 47, and the date is important because there's no settlements and no occupation and no Nakba and no refugees, and like all the things that we are told that are the causes of the conflict don't exist yet. So by definition, they cannot be the causes. And in February 47, he says, His Majesty's government is thus faced with an irreconcilable conflict. And he calls it irreconcilable of February of 47. And he goes on to explain why it's irreconcilable, again, because he listened to the sides. And he says there's two groups in the land, Jews and Arabs, so there's no question about those being the groups. And he says each one of them has a top priority, the one thing they value above everything else. And he says for the Jews, the top priority is to establish a Jewish state. So the Jews want self-determination for their people, for their nation. That's the general principle of that century. And then he says for the Arabs, the top priority is to prevent to the last the establishment of a Jewish state in any part of the land. By definition, irreconcilable. He's not saying the Jews aspire to a state and the Arabs aspire to a state. That is very much a reconcilable conflict by means of two states, a partition. If both sides want a state, maybe they'll have some border disputes, but ultimately, those are two ideas that are reconcilable. But if one side wants a state and the other side wants them not to have a state, then it's irreconcilable. So yes, going back to the 20s and 30s and 40s of the 1900s, the Arabs already made it clear that their top priority, their goal, is not independence for themselves. That is a secondary priority. The top priority is first that the Jews will not have independence, and then they can take care of everything else.
And how much of that links to what the PLO leaders are then saying about Arab unity and the thing that really binds what we call Palestinians, which was previously referred to as Arabs of the Levant, Arabs west of the Jordan River? What binds them is a sense of camaraderie, of unity in resisting Jewish self-determination, rather than any integral cultural, socio-political cohesion.
So here it begins to go to the question of who are the enablers of this battle. Because one of the things that the Arabs of the land, and at this point, really, you have the beginning in the 19th century, as with generally across the region, the rise of broader Arab nationalism. You have the rise of a lot of other movements of Islamism and the Muslim Brotherhood and Arab nationalism, and of course, Zionism as the idea of Jewish self-determination. So a lot of these ideas are around, but specifically the Arabs of the Levant at this point, they're not separate. If anything, there's a more local identity of being from Jaffa or being from Hebron. But what the Arabs of the Levant discover fairly early on is that they have a massive asset in the fact that they are battling the Jews, and not just any Jews, but Jews who are seeking self-determination, independence in their ancestral homeland. So really a grand theological story. And they discover that because those are the people they are battling, they can always rely at any given moment on the most anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist ideology of the moment. So in the 30s and 40s, they have a very fruitful collaboration with the Nazis. People now try to make it as if it's a marginal issue, as if it's a small picture of the Mufti sitting with Hitler. But the Arabs were part of the Axis. They wanted German and Nazi victory. The Mufti certainly was part of the Nazi operations. He escaped trials in Nuremberg through a deal. And a lot of Nazi propaganda is inserted into the Arab world, and really with implications to the present. We see Nazi ideology in the roots of Hamas. Mein Kampf in Arabic continues to be very popular in the Arab world. And of course, the only reason that the Mufti was and the Arabs were prevented from slaughtering all the Jews in the area is because Montgomery stopped the Nazis in El Alamein. Now, in the 50s and 60s, the emergence of pan-Arabism as the defining idea of Arab unity, it becomes centered on anti-Zionism as a defining idea. And in the process, it turns Palestinianism into the secular theology of the Arab world. So this is why, especially quotes from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, you'll have a lot of emphasis on Palestinianism as the core of Arab unity, as the mark of Arab unity. And again, it's not a coincidence that those who hide behind Palestinianism, who turn it into really a theology, are also who have the most anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish ideologies. It works together. Palestinianism is really the mask behind which anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism hides. So under this obsession with Arab unity as anti-Zionism, what you have is the ethnic cleansing of Jews from the entire Arab world, from Morocco to Afghanistan. Again, and they say it's not about Jews, they love Jews, it's only anti-Zionism. But it really gives you a sense that when a society becomes obsessed with anti-Zionism as its defining ideology, even as it protests that it has nothing against Jews and it loves Jews, the outcome is always that no Jews are left. It becomes hostile to Jewish life, and ultimately the Jews are out. And by the way, the only difference between the ethnic cleansing of Jews from the Arab world in the 50s, in the name, again, of anti-Zionism, not against Jews, and the difference between the ethnic cleansing and ultimately genocide of Jews from Europe in the 1930s and 40s, is that this time there was Israel. There was a state of Israel where many of the Jews from the Arab world, as they were expelled, ethnically cleansed, pushed out, they could flee to. In the 1930s, there should have been a state of Israel if Britain had not betrayed the mandate and caved into Arab violence. But Arab violence already in the 30s played a crucial role in preventing the Jewish state from coming into being. So the Arabs were not able to slaughter all the Jews in the land, but what they were able to do is to prevent the Jewish state from gaining independence in the 1930s as it should have. And thereby, there was no state of Israel in time to absorb the Jews fleeing Europe. And as a result, what could have been only an ethnic cleansing of Jews from Europe became a genocide.
Wow,
an actual one.
So there's almost a shadow Holocaust that has not been commemorated, which is not only, it was about 850,000, wasn't it, Jews from the Mizrach, from the Arab world, but also the potential lives saved if the vehicle of Israel and Zionism had materialized sooner.
Precisely.
I want to come back to your Westsplaining paradigm, because what you've just said to me is the answer to the Westsplaining. What is the Westsplaining?
So Westsplaining is when Western diplomats and journalists explain away what Arabs and especially Palestinians are very clearly expressing. So it, just like mansplaining, it has the same attitude that you know better, a bit like that European official, they don't get to decide. So the Arabs, to their credit, especially when you go down the history in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, really, they're very clear about their goals. They make it very clear that, for example, their opposition to partition, to the UN proposal in November 47, they make it very clear that their opposition is not to the way that the map was drawn or to this or that border, or that if the Jewish state was a little bit smaller, it would be acceptable to them. They actually say not even the size of a postage stamp. So they make it clear that their opposition is to a Jewish state. I think in the book we include a conversation between Chaim Weizmann, Abba Eban, on the eve of the partition vote with Azam Pasha, the head of the Arab League. Again, the Arab League pretty much created the idea of Arab unity organized around anti-Zionism, around the opposition to a Jewish state. That's the source of what brings the Arabs together. So he says, even if partition passes tomorrow, even if the vote for a Jewish state and an Arab state passes, we're going to go to war because it would be against our honor. He defines it as a matter of honor. It would be against our honor to accept the existence of a Jewish state. It tells you that from their perspective, the idea of sovereign, independent Jews is anathema, is in its mere existence. Sovereign, upright, confident Jews is a humiliation. And he says, we will fight you. We will go to war. And if we win, then you will not have your state. And that tells you what would have happened. And if we lose and you have your state, he says, we will still not accept it. And then he says, maybe after 400 years, we will come to terms and live with it. That's pretty much the timeline. So again,
and
to the
what's the West? How is the West translating that into a way which forms this corrupt idealism or corrupt humanitarianism that you're now writing about?
Oh, that the Arabs, that the Jewish state is a colonial implant and the Arabs were merely resisting and it is their just right. Or no, it's because partition, because the map was not fair, that they opposed it because the map was not fair. And I have this image that I put on Twitter a few months ago on marking November 29th, which really shows the partition map and the incidence of malaria in the early 20th century, demonstrating that Zionism is about the least colonial movement in history, that the lands that were allocated to the Jewish state through partition were the lands reclaimed by the Zionists from malaria, plus the desert. All the good lands essentially went to the Arab state.
Right. But I understood Westsplaining more as a modern, as a description of a kind of post-90s rhetoric when the peace process collapsed. I mean, I'm projecting this onto your terms, so I'm asking you to correct me.
Yeah.
I'm not defining it for you. But what it sounded like to me was this idea that post the collapse of the 90s the left-wing approach, land for peace, that the West had started to find increasingly implausible and nebulous ways to couch radicalism, Islamic radicalism and Islamic imperialism in terms of Israel's fault. So it's because there's not enough aid getting into Gaza, or it's because of your lunatic settlers stirring up trouble, or it's because of the way that the army behave around Al-Aqsa Mosque, or it's because of the rhetoric of the Israeli right.
Yes. So you're absolutely right that Westsplaining becomes more relevant in the 90s. You really don't have it much before because, again, the Arabs are very, very clear. And why are they very clear up to the 90s? Because they have powerful backers, not least of which are the Soviets. So under the Soviets and the Cold War, when you look at the Arab terminology, when you look at the Palestinian terminology, it's very clear. And they don't do a lot of hiding, even though, again, the Soviet Union is very sophisticated in, again, just like the Arab world used Palestinianism to hide its anti-Zionism, the same ways the Soviet Union uses the idea of Palestinian rights and begins to insert it to international bodies through the 1975 Zionism is Racism resolution, which creates the whole infrastructure of Palestinian rights in the UN, really beginning the process that already started in the 60s of hijacking the United Nations, international bodies, the whole infrastructure of human rights, entirely hijacking them to initially the Soviet ideology, to anti-Western ideology, to anti-Zionist ideology. And again, we're living with the implications of that. But you're right that once the Soviet Union collapsed and we enter the 90s and the Palestinians begin to seek Western support because they've lost their Soviet backers, they begin to use a language which to them is very clear, but to the West is interpreted differently. Language like justice, language like rights. Now, when Palestinians say justice, or when Arabs say justice, again, you need to go to texts in the 50s and 60s to see that. We discuss it in the book. They mean only one thing. Justice is the correction of the injustice, which is the very creation of the state of Israel. Now, when Westerners hear justice, they think, okay, the Palestinians should have a state. Oh, the occupation is really bad. You know, the settlements need to go away. That's how they interpret justice. But when Palestinians say justice, it's one thing. It's correcting the injustice, which is the state of Israel. When Palestinians say rights, the West hears, oh, really, you know, again, the occupation should be over. They have the right to self-determination. They should have a state. When Palestinians say rights, they only mean one right, and that is the non-existence, by the way, right of return. There's no such right. But, and again, the idea of return, we should let go of the notion that it's anything innocent. October 7th is the realization of return. So again, when Palestinians say rights, they mean return, they mean no Jewish state. When the West hears rights, they think, oh, state and the occupation. So there's a lot of Westsplaining all the time. Westsplaining is also characterized by inversion of cause and effect. So people will say the occupation is the cause of the conflict. As I said, we can go and see that it's not, right? It was irreconcilable already in February 47. There's no occupation. People say the occupation is the cause of the conflict. But just a minute, why is there an occupation? Because, again, Arab countries repeatedly went to war and lost. And why is the occupation not over? Because every time that Israel offered to end the occupation through an agreement of establishing a Palestinian state, we're talking the year 2000, the year 2008. Every time that the Palestinians could have ended the occupation with a sovereign state, but that would have meant accepting the Jewish state. Remember, go back to Bevin, accepting the Jewish state, accepting that a Palestinian state would be next to the Jewish state of Israel rather than instead of it, meaning that there's no such thing as return into the Jewish state. Every time they walked away, Arafat walks away in 2000, Abu Mazen walks away in 2008. They follow it up with violence. So the occupation is not the cause of the conflict, it's the outcome. So a lot of Westsplaining is reversal of cause and effect. We're even seeing it now happen in real time. People are tweeting, look at Israel's response. This should show you that October 7th was justified. This is like reversal of cause and effect in real time, like justifying October 7th by the Israeli response to it. So a lot of Westsplaining operates by essentially explaining away Palestinian actions and Palestinian sayings and words as being much more benign than they are.
Okay, so I get it now. So there's two elements. There's the West telling Israel that the words of rights and of justice that are parroted from the West in the mouths of the Arabs are said with integrity to the Western construct of those ideas of justice and rights, telling Israel to take them at face value when we know that they don't mean those things. And then when violence ensues because they don't mean those things.
Well, they mean them in a different way.
They mean them in a different way, in quite a violent and radical way. The violence that then ensues from that meaning is then reconstituted as a result of Israel's actions.
Yeah.
There's a kind of wider political climate around what you call Westsplaining that I wanted to ask you about. There's a great book called The Light That Failed. I don't know if you're aware of it. It's by a Bulgarian political scientist, but it really, your book really reminded me of this book, because this book is all about the Eastern European attempts to mimic Western constructs post the fall of the Berlin Wall, and how the fact that they just didn't fit the way that the governance and the institutions were setting themselves up. It was really a parroting of Western ideals, and how the fact that they didn't fit has given rise to ethno-nationalism now, what we're seeing kind of in Hungary and other places. And this also reminds me of what's going on in South America with the El Salvadorian president, Bukele, who's coming out and saying very directly, your approach to government, your paradigms, your what you would call Westsplaining, almost liberal-splaining, it does not work here. We have the highest murder rate in the world. We have mafia gangs destroying our society, and we need to deal with it in the way that we know how to deal with it. So is there something in your thesis that is also tapping in to a kind of new national confidence and rhetoric around saying no to Westsplaining?
It's tough for me to say if there's something new in that. In that sense, being Jewish, you tap into something that is millennia old, really a sense of tribe and a people. And we are very much aware how often the idea of what it means to be Jewish, and especially the idea of the Jews as a people, as a nation, as a tribe, historically flies in the face of a Western construct, and that actually officially happened, that began after the French Revolution, of to try to argue that Jews are only a religion. As the process of indeed beautiful and noble ideals of emancipation and inclusion, the price of entrance of Jews to Western society was the reformulation of the idea of Judaism as a religion, and essentially a religion only, that it is a matter of personal faith, of personal communal habits, but you're not a nation and you're not a people. And Zionism emerges from the insistence precisely that those Western ideals have failed. At this point, it's mostly European ideals with the rise of anti-Semitism, that the noble European ideas of inclusion are failing, and that the Jews are basically first and foremost a nation. They are reclaiming themselves against this European effort to argue that they are only a religion, that they are a people and a nation. And because they are a people and a nation, they have the right to self-determination. And where else will they exercise their right to self-determination except in the only one land, Zion, to which they ever had a historical connection as a people? So when you're Jewish, you're constantly aware of the differences between the historical sense of who we are and various Western constructs of who we're supposed to be.
Okay, so that leads me on to, I think, something that was in my head the whole time I was reading your book and listening to you, which was, obviously you've come from the Israeli left. The Israeli left is often quite different to, certainly to the British left, but also to the American left, in that it contains so many of the progressive and liberal ideals in terms of social policy, but it can often have a much more realistic approach to security. You served under Shimon Peres. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. You were very much part of the Land for Peace era, which was the left's approach to negotiating and really seeing the best of what could be said by the Arabs within Israel and on the borders. And now you're one of the most outspoken voices almost against that paradigm for a much more shrewd understanding. of what the Palestinian cause has been, but you haven't necessarily left the left. Can you explain that to me?
Certainly. So first of all, you're right that to begin with, much of the Israeli left is much more national. People in the left, again, except for really, really intense fringes, they support the idea of a Jewish state. They're Zionists, they're secular, like me, on all issues, gay rights, family, women, men. I mean, all these issues, socialism, healthcare, education. It's very much on the left. I'm very much on the left. Like on all issues social, you would find me way on the fringes of the left. But I am very much Jewish, and I support the idea of a Jewish people and the Jewish people's right to self-determination. I have a deep sense of solidarity with my people. I care about my people. And people sometimes say, oh, how can you be like an atheist? And, you're like those people who insist on a Jewish state in your ancestral homeland. But you say God promised it to you. And it's such like a kindergarten level. And a lot of people think it's a super smart argument. And again, the idea of a people and a nation for pretty much everyone in the world until the 19th century included a strong element of God. Beginning in the 19th century, a lot of people are secular, but it doesn't make the idea of a people and a nation and the historical connection between a people and a nation, it doesn't make it disappear. It doesn't erase it. It is very much in the definition of who we are as a people. So like on all issues, social, secularism, I'm very much of the left. And I would even say that on the issue of land for peace, two states, I'm still of the left. I still believe that the Arabs of the West Bank and Gaza have very much the right to govern themselves by themselves. I just want to make sure that they're going to do it for themselves and not for the purpose of destroying the Jewish state. So when people ask me, how are you, like you said, you're a shrewd observer of what the Arabs and Palestinians are saying, that their goal is the destruction of the Jewish state. How can you support self-governance for them? And I say, look, the day that they end this, then of course they can govern themselves. Precisely because I focus on the ideology, I say, absolutely. Two states, the day that the Palestinian Arabs end their century-long war against Zionism, the day that they decide that they want to live next to the Jewish state of Israel rather than instead of it, is the day we make peace.
But you also say, in many ways, Palestinianism at its core is simply a resistance movement to Israel. So I suppose...
Of course, it's a destruction movement.
The bit that clashes for me, and I'm not sure where I am with this politically, but it seems that you're diagnosing the problem as, in part, the construction of an identity that has been swallowed wholesale by predominantly the left, but in general by any, as you say, interested actors from Russia to the Arab world, to the whole of the Islamic world, and to the Western progressive world. So if this construction of an identity is the source of an issue, surely that is what needs to be tackled, not the way that the Arabs organize themselves or express themselves.
Precisely. I say it, that what the task ahead is essentially the reconstruction of the Palestinian identity. And some people say because the Palestinian identity has been based on the destruction of the Jewish state, the negation of Zionism, to reconstruct it means that it's gone. And then people say, okay, so then just have Jordan essentially take over the West Bank and Egypt take over Gaza. And again, I'm not opposed to any sovereignty. I'm agnostic on that. But I am very clear that we need to end the construction of the Palestinian identity as one that is singularly focused on the destruction of the Jewish state. In many ways, it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy for a people to be nothing but devoted to the destruction of others. It's a terrible, terrible fate. So you're asking a fundamental question for which we have no answer because we haven't tried. Could we actually achieve a reconstruction of a Palestinian identity towards one that is constructive, one that wants to live next to the Jewish state rather than instead of it? In the process of such reconstruction, does anything remain that is uniquely Palestinian as opposed to Jordanian or Arab or Egyptian, we're not clear. But I am clear on the fact that indeed nothing less than the reconstruction of Palestinianism as an identity opposed to the existence of a Jewish state can bring us to peace.
Are there any examples in the Arab world of Sunni Muslim grassroots movement towards self-determination which have resulted in peaceful governance? It seems to me every single national entity in the region is an ethno-state run by a small ethnic elite who simply bulldoze and machine gun down anything resembling self-determination. That we've seen that across the whole of North Africa has lost hundreds of thousands of lives just to maintain a system of relative order, and these are not democratic systems. Why do we believe that this small population of Sunni Muslims who call themselves Palestinians have, as you say, historically no glue to that society other than as a resistance movement, and now have 70 odd years of radicalization under their belt, multiple generations, no political elite, no academic elite, bureaucrats, diplomats that we can call something that would function as a society? How is part of this leaving of the left that I see underneath this really about letting go of that idealism, the idealism that there is a society there that's going to emerge?
So first, as a parenthesis, you use the term ethno-state, it seems negatively, and I always make it clear to people that most successful states are essentially, the idea of self-determination is based on the idea that there is a nation that has a certain cohesion of language and ethnicity and religion, and even when it's secular, it's like historical religion and a connection to land. So
sorry, just to clarify, I didn't mean ethno-state in a way that others aren't. I mean ethno-state in a way which is contrary to the Sunni Muslim majority. So Jordan is ruled by a Hashemite kingdom. Syria is
so that's actually the opposite of an ethno-state. But so right. If you have the Alawites or the Hashemites rule over different...
a feudalism, you would say, with one ethnicity at the top.
Exactly. So that's something else. Again, you're absolutely right. It's a question that I ask myself constantly. It doesn't mean, it means that ultimately these processes will have to come from the Arab world itself and its construction of identity and who they are. The fundamental issue is that there are people, okay? There are Homo sapiens. Let's go back to that. There are Homo sapiens living in the land who do not identify as Jews, who do not identify as being members of the Jewish people, and have no interest also in being citizens, supportive, even when they're not Jewish, non-Jewish citizens of a state devoted to being the sovereign state of the Jewish people. So they need to be governed somehow, not by Israel. Okay, let's go the most basic way. They need to be governed by someone that is not Israel. And now you're saying, okay, could be Jordan, it could be Egypt, it could be an Arab construction, was offered an Arab mandate, or it could be the transformation of those people into something else. At the end of the day, Homo sapiens are entirely capable of developing new ideas, new identities, new goals. This is human history. Human history is the transformation of human goals, human identities, human stories. We're seeing transformation takes place in the Arab world right now, in some of the Gulf states. Again, you're right, those are small elites, but they're beginning to transform the sense of who they are, what it means to be Arab, what it means to be Muslim, what it means to be a nation. What you're describing across the Arab world is actually the fruit of a kind of arrested process, because in Europe, the transition from empires to nation states, so-called ethno-states, Norway is an ethno-state, Sweden is an ethno-state, even though we think of them as nice states. So the transition from empires to nation states in Europe, the fall of the Russian, the Habsburg, the German empires, the Ottoman Empire in the part of Europe was bloody. It included 2 world wars and regional wars, and the war in Yugoslavia is essentially a delayed process of that. It's massively bloody. The creation of new borders where these new states and people flee across newly created borders. This has been a bloody, bloody process. It also comes with a lot of benefits in the sense of the spread of democracy and rights and people governing themselves once they have a state of a people. What happened is that when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and a similar process, a bloody process, could have taken place there, it was actually carved out by the British and the French in this kind of interim process of the mandates. So, and you've had the creation of the Arab states, Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Jordan. And a lot of what you're seeing across the Arab world today is, sometimes I call it the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire 100 years delayed. So again, the process of them beginning to determine themselves, to decide who they are, what kind of states they are. And you're right, maybe at the end of this, we already see Iraq is not much of a state. Who knows if the Jordanian Hashemite country will remain. We've seen Syria break apart. We're seeing it happen in Algeria, in Libya. You see that countries that have more national cohesion, historical, Egypt, Morocco, they might survive this breakdown of the Ottoman Empire. You're right. Will Palestinianism survive it? Who knows? All I'm saying is, from my perspective, I know what they cannot be, and I know what it looks like when there's peace. They cannot be a people whose entire definition is to destroy the Jewish state. If they become a people who want to live next to the Jewish state, then we should make peace with them. That's all I'm saying.
We've got a strange situation at the moment with, particularly where I am in London, where we're kind of in this battleground, this local battleground in relation to the conflict. We're seeing local council meetings disrupted by Palestinian protesters. There's an underlying religious kind of tension. The Scottish First Minister today said a prayer and a hadith in Scottish Parliament. It's obviously caused quite a stir. And then over in the States, there seems to be this split emerging on the American right, with the more libertarian faction saying, this has got nothing to do with us. Why are we sending another 3 billion? Why is this dominating our media? With the conservative right saying, no, this democratic alliance with Israel is still, if not even more so, a core part of who we are as American conservatives. How is what you're saying directed, or is it directed or targeted at these different political discourses in the West? And, you know, if so, how do you target them?
So my biggest concern, again, is the safety and survival of my people. And what I follow the rise of the dangers to us. I follow the rise of anti-Zionism in the West. And over the years, as people try to kind of have a theoretical debate as to whether anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism, what I increasingly realized is that it's not a theoretical debate, it's a practical debate. And I asked myself, what happens to societies where anti-Zionism rises? And as I said, the answer is always the same: no Jews are left. And the reason is that it does express an obsession with Jews, and that obsession is always the mark of a failed society, or the rise of failure and crisis in a society. I do not define anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism as a prejudice or a conspiracy or a hatred even. I define it as a political scapegoating mechanism for societies in crisis. And the theoretician of societies in crisis, René Girard, said that societies in crisis ask 2 questions: what to do and who to blame. And societies that ultimately prioritize what to do get out of the crisis. And societies who get stuck in who to blame tend to just sink deeper into the crisis. And especially in Western and Islamic societies, the Jewish scapegoat is just ready-made. It's off the shelf. It has centuries and millennia of cultural capital invested in that Jewish scapegoat, right? You only need to say baby killers, and you're tapping into centuries and millennia of blood libel about Jews ritually enjoying the blood of non-Jewish children. So you just need to say two words and you're tapping into centuries and millennia of cultural capital. So the Jews are a ready scapegoat. And when you see the rise of anti-Zionism, placards like "Keep the World Clean" with the Star of David in the trash bin, you know that you're watching a society in crisis. And you're watching a society in crisis that is running away from the question of what it needs to do and trying to settle into the much more comfortable who to blame. Now, I'm not an American, I'm not British, so I highlight sometimes that people who are British or American should care about what this means to their society, because no society got obsessed with anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism and somehow came out better for it. So I highlight the fact that the societies should be concerned. But as I said, my immediate concern is for my people. And I want to make sure that as the societies enter into this vortex, they cause as little harm to our people as possible, because historically they've caused tremendous harm as they entered into these vortex of obsession with Jews, from Nazi Germany to the ethnic cleansing of Jews from the Arab world to how the Soviet Union treated its Jews. I fear for that, but my concern right now is my people. The only message that I have to non-Jews in the West as they watch their societies gripped by this insanity is I can assure them that nothing good awaits for them on the other side of it. So to the extent that they care about their societies, to the extent that they care about having thriving Jewish lives in their societies, right? The Arab world could have done itself no greater hurt than throw away its productive, loyal Jewish members. So to the extent that those societies care about their future, about the future of Jewish thriving in those societies, they should be very concerned and they should battle anti-Zionism. But as I said, my immediate concern is my people.
One tiny question then, on the what to do part of that, I suppose my mind, with all that you're saying, it moves to the political right because of all the things you're saying. I mean, you're talking about René Girard. He's become held up by the right, by the Trump administration, by Peter Thiel, was saying, listen to what René Girard said about our society. You're talking about realism and treating Arabs as adults, not children. This is what the Abraham Accords really was getting together the grown-ups in the room in the Middle East. And this is the right-wing paradigm. Surely there has to be some concession to the center ground or the gravitational center of politics for that needle to move to the right. If what you're saying is true, and we need to form the right allegiances for the what to do bit.
Again, this is for the societies to do. But as someone recently said, being patriotic, having a sense of solidarity with your people, believing in human agency, in being a grown-up, those used to be fundamental ideas. Now they're considered extreme right-wing. So again, I don't play into that. Whether it's my work on education or my work on politics or this, I talk about these ideas to the extent that, believing in the equality of men and women, in the right of people socially to love whoever they want, to marry whoever they want, to believe in public health care, universal health care, public education, the importance of that. To the extent that those are left-wing ideas, they're left-wing. Sometimes I call myself extremely left-wing, extremely right-wing. I don't care about these labels as much as just talking about the ideas themselves.
You're saying truth is not a right-wing or a left-wing thing.
Oh, that's for sure.
Okay. Einat Wilf, it was such a pleasure and privilege to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for this initiative. It's valuable.